everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our World Affairs Lecture Series. Today's topic is a letter from Kurdistan. My name is Kamal Bewar, and my students call me Dr. Kamal or Dr. Bewar. I love Bewar because for obvious personal reasons. And I work for SALIC as a full staff member and adjunct faculty member as well. I want to welcome our special guest speaker, Ms. Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman. Bayan, she will lead our discussion today about Kurdish and Kurdistan. Bayan is a Kurdistan regional government representative in the United States. Before her appointment in 2015, Bayan was a high representative to the United Kingdom. Bayan was elected to the Leadership Council of Kurdistan Democratic Party in 2010. Prior to her public service career, she was a generalist for 17 years, and she won Observer newspaper Farzad Basel Memorial Prize in 1993. Without further ado, please help me to welcome Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bewar, or Kamal, if I may call you Kamal. Thank you so much for that introduction. And until tonight, I didn't know that you had met my late father, so I'm so happy that we have this great connection. I will go straight into the presentation. So I assume that you can see what I can see on the screen. So that's me. I'm Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman. And we go to the next slide. I will do a PowerPoint presentation that will give you a very brief outline about Kurdistan's geography, a very, very short recent history, and then talk about where we are today. And of course, I also want to discuss our relationship and our partnership with the United States. So whenever you talk about Kurdistan, you have to talk about maps. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to show you that, as I'm sure many of you know, Kurdistan is divided between 4 countries. This is a great simplification. I can go into detail if we had more time, but since time is short, in brief, Kurdistan is divided between 4 countries: Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. This is not necessarily a very accurate map, but I think it gives you an idea of the geography of all of Kurdistan. And in terms of population, all of Kurdistan, perhaps, oh, somebody's saying we lost the map. So perhaps there are 40 million Kurds in that area. And there are many Kurds who fled to Europe from those countries, fled to Europe, excuse me, from those countries. And so in Europe, I would say there are 1.5, maybe 2 million Kurds who most arrived as refugees, fleeing some kind of conflict in those countries. In the United States, there are perhaps 50,000 Kurds, maybe another 20,000 in Canada. Nobody is really sure about the number of Kurds in those countries or abroad, because those governments try to always minimize the number of Kurds by saying everyone is Turkish or Iranian or whatever. And the Kurds, the nationalists among us, will exaggerate our number. So I opt for 40 million, which still makes the Kurds one of the larger cultural or racial groups, ethnic groups in the Middle East. So that's where Kurdistan is across the Middle East. If we go to the next slide, we will see Kurdistan in Iraq. So as Dr. Bewar introduced me as the representative of the Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdistan regional government only functions in Iraqi Kurdistan. So while we have relatives, we may have other types of links with our brethren in Turkey, in Iran, in Syria, as a government, we represent only Iraqi Kurdistan. So why are all these different colors on this map of Iraqi Kurdistan? Again, I have to say that this map is not necessarily 100% accurate. It's just to give you a rough idea. So the green area is largely, and the pink area is largely governed by the Kurdistan regional government and is considered part of Kurdistan region in Iraq. The yellow areas and are considered disputed territories. So these are territories that we believe were Kurdish. Culturally, historically, linguistically, these areas were Kurdish. Over time, through genocide, through displacement, through gerrymandering, through a lot of violence, there has been demographic change in those areas. And so they became known as disputed territories, and this is how they're referred to in the Iraqi constitution. Now, Kurdistan, I think you can say, is perhaps comparable to Scotland within the United Kingdom, or Quebec within Canada, Catalonia in Spain, or Flanders in Belgium. I'll stick to Scotland because that's probably the place I know best, since I grew up in the United Kingdom and I visited Scotland countless times. Scotland also has a population of about 5 million, similar to Iraqi Kurdistan or the region of Kurdistan. We also have highlands and mountains, just like the Scots. We have a very independent and free spirit, and I would say that's true of the Scots as well. And we and Scotland are a nation and a region within a larger sovereign state. So this is really how I would describe Kurdistan region of Iraq. If we go to the next slide, there's a little bit more information. Kurdistan region is recognized within the Iraqi constitution. So that means that our government has rights, but also responsibilities. As I said, the population of over 5 million, but we also, of course, have a population of refugees and displaced people of about 1 million. A few years ago, it was 2 million. Now it's been reduced to about 1 million. And as you can see, Kurdistan has beautiful mountains and landscape. And I have been fortunate enough to visit Utah and specifically Salt Lake City. And I have seen the incredible mountains as you fly or you come into land, and it's just magnificent. And it always reminds me of Kurdistan when I see that. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that Kurdistan is really a diverse place. Of course, the majority of the people in Iraqi Kurdistan are Kurdish and Sunni Muslim. So most of us Kurds are Sunni Muslim, and that's the majority of the population. But we're very, very proud that we have so many diverse cultures. There are Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen, Assyrians, Karkis, Shabak, Arabs, all living together in the Kurdistan region. And we're very, very proud that Kurdistan has passed many laws protecting the rights of people of different cultural and religious and ethnic backgrounds. There are TV stations in various different languages that are spoken in Kurdistan. There are schools for different languages that are spoken. And also there is a ministry for endowment and religious affairs. And in that Ministry of Religious Affairs, there are representatives of 8 different faiths within that ministry. And that includes Christians, Yazidis, and Baha'is. And I mention Baha'is because in the rest of Iraq, if you're a Baha'i, you will have a very difficult time. In Kurdistan, we accept whatever faith you are, frankly. Everybody accepts each other, people of all faiths. And we're very, very proud of that. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that just last month, we were honored by a visit from Pope Francis, who visited Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan region, and was able to hold mass in a soccer stadium with about 10,000 people. The stadium holds many more, but because of COVID-19 restrictions, the number of participants was limited to 10,000. And as I said, we were honored by the Pope's visit. He actually visited several places in Iraq, and the last stop on his trip was Kurdistan, where he held this mass. And I think we're very proud that Pope Francis recognized Kurdistan as a place of peace and tolerance. And he also thanked the Kurdistan region, the people and the government, for being open to so many people who were fleeing conflict and specifically religious persecution. I've said this a few times, that Kurdistan is a kind of a safe haven. And there is a reason for that. And I think one of the reasons, I should say, one of the reasons for that is our own history of suffering. If we go to the next slide, Kurdistan region has had a history of genocide, really going back decades. From the 1950s onwards, perhaps even earlier, our people were targeted simply because they were Kurds, simply because they were not Arabs, or because we didn't support the particular government or regime that was in power. And Iraq has always had a turbulent history. There have been very, very short periods of peace since the creation of the state of Iraq about just under 100 years ago. Our lot within Iraq has been a tragic history of genocide, of persecution, of disappearances. And of course, I'm sure many of you will have heard about the Halabja chemical attack that took place in 1988. That's in the next slide. In what happened was in Halabja, a city of about 70,000 people, Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq at the time, used chemical weapons to bombard the city and killed 5,000 people. And they were innocent civilians, women, children, and men who were going about their daily lives. And in this genocide, as I said, 5,000 were killed and about 10,000 were wounded. Many of those wounded are even today living with the wounds that they suffered on that day. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Kurd who was in Halabja at the time, who eventually managed to flee and made his way to the United States to make a new life. He survived the genocide, obviously, but all of the remainder of his life, he suffered from respiratory problems, and he had a lung transplant recently, and just a couple of weeks ago, he succumbed finally to his wounds. So these episodes of genocide, it wasn't just once, it wasn't just twice, it happened over and over again to different communities within our society. The city of Halabja, the Barzani tribes, 8,000 men and boys from the Barzani tribe disappeared in July of 1983. And they were taken by the Iraqi military and disappeared, never to be found again. The Failis, who are a religious minority, again, they were persecuted and killed and disappeared. And then I mentioned the Halabja genocide and Anfal. Anfal was a specific genocide operation in which maybe 200,000 people were killed in the space of less than a year. So this has been our recent history in Iraq and our suffering. So for us, I think it's critical that we keep our doors open to people who are fleeing. We all have been displaced. We have a very small team here in my office in Washington. We're a small team. Every single one of us has been displaced or been a refugee. Every single one of us. Every single one of us has, as Dr. Bewar mentioned earlier, has suffered some kind of calamity within our family, whether it was through a terrorist act, like my father and my brother, or through one of these episodes of genocide, or some other kind of catastrophe that has befallen the people of Kurdistan. Now, this was our history, particularly in the 1980s. There was a destruction of 4,500 villages, and this broke the back of Kurdish society and Kurdish industry. Most of us were farmers in villages. So when Saddam destroyed 4,500 villages, this killed off not only, of course, the people, but it killed off a whole industry that had been the breadbasket of Iraq. It also meant that our people were absolutely terrorized by the dictatorship, because there's nothing you can do with chemical weapons. You can't fight back. We had no resources to fight back. So just to move on to the next slide, everything changed for us in 1991. And this year, and in fact this month, we are celebrating and marking the anniversary of Operation Provide Comfort in 1991. Now, why did that change everything for us? So I've just given you the background of the dark days that we suffered in Iraq under various regimes, but particularly under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. Then Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, and the US-led coalition pushed him out of Kuwait, and the people of southern Iraq and the Kurdistan region rebelled against Saddam Hussein in March of 1991. There was a great uprising, and we all thought that he would be overthrown and that the coalition and the United States would come and support this uprising. Unfortunately, the support didn't come, and Saddam Hussein, even though he had been defeated in Kuwait, was still able to use his tanks, his helicopter gunships to chase and terrorize and bombard the Kurdish people and the people of southern Iraq who had risen up against him. And having just suffered a decade or so of disappearances and chemical bombardment, our people feared that Saddam was going to use chemical bombs again. And so hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps as many as 2 million Kurds, fearing chemical weapons again in April and March and April 1991, fled Kurdistan to try to cross into Turkey and Iran to escape the chemical weapons, or what they thought would be chemical weapons. And they got stuck on the mountainside. Imagine, I mean, this is kind of a biblical scene of 2 million people fleeing to the mountains in the mud, in the snow, with nothing but what they had on their backs and the clothes that they were in. Many of the children couldn't make the journey and died on that journey, died of starvation and hunger and exposure. My own grandfather died and just couldn't make that journey as well. And I am sure there are many, many others who have similar stories. But what changed was that pictures of this mass exodus and the suffering made it onto the international scene. All of the suffering that we'd been through before, somehow it didn't make it onto the international stage. I'm sure governments were aware of it, but the media was not able to report on it. This was different this time, and I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the media, including the Americans and the British media, and the French as well, I know, who highlighted what was happening to the Kurds on the mountainside. And so Britain, the United States and France launched Operation Provide Comfort, established a no-fly zone over Kurdistan for the next really 12 years or so, all the way to 2003, to protect the Kurds from Saddam Hussein. This transformed everything for us. It meant that for the first time, we were protected from Saddam's regime, from any regime in Baghdad, but particularly Saddam, who was so brutal, mostly to the Kurds, but also to the Arabs in Iraq and to anybody who opposed his regime. It meant that for the first time, while we were protected, we could hold free elections in Kurdistan. And that's what we did. In 1992, we had elections in Kurdistan. After the elections, we created the Kurdistan Parliament. We created the institutions that we have today, the presidency, the Council of Ministers or the cabinet. We passed a law that recognized the Peshmerga as our legitimate military force, and other institutions that we have today, including, for example, the representations abroad, like our office in Washington, D.C. And so we began to be able to have some form of self-governance after 1991 and after Operation Provide Comfort. And we're marking Operation Provide Comfort this year, the 30th anniversary, and thanking all of our friends in America who were involved. And I would include in that Congressman Chris Stewart, who is from Utah and a very good friend of the Kurds and is co-chair of the Kurdish-American Congressional Caucus here in Washington. He was, I believe, in the Air Force and flew over the no-fly zone to protect the Kurds. So I'm sure there are many other connections to people from Utah who may have been involved. So by the end of the 1990s, let's say around 2000, that time, Kurdistan had stabilized. We had had many internal difficulties. We had even fallen into a civil war. We were able to recover from that. And by around 2000, Kurdistan had stabilized and was protected largely, not completely. And then we had the liberation of Iraq in 2003. If we go to the next slide. Now, the United States and other allies liberated Iraq in 2003. And I know for many, that was a very controversial step. For us, it wasn't controversial. After decades of brutality, of dictatorship, of violence, of being denied our rights, we did see it as a liberation. And we thought that it was right and just that a dictator like Saddam Hussein should be removed. And really the liberation in 2003 opened up a golden decade for us. Over the next 10 years, Kurdistan region was able to thrive. We were recognized, as I said, in the constitution. We opened international airports. We opened universities. In 1991, we had only one university. Today, we have well over 30 universities. Some are private, some are government run. We have 2 American universities even, and we have started an oil industry from scratch. And really this was a flourishing of Kurdistan over this decade. The media flourished, we were connected by the internet, we were able to travel and people were able to travel to Kurdistan. Unfortunately, in parallel with these good times and the flourishing and the boom, the economic boom that we had, our relationship with Baghdad was deteriorating at the same time. After the liberation, we committed ourselves as Kurds to the new Iraq. We thought that this was an opportunity for Iraq to be federal, to be democratic, and to be a country that recognized everybody, whether you were Kurdish or Arab, whether you were Christian or Muslim or Yazidi, we were all equal. And we committed ourselves to this new Iraq. However, over time, different governments in Baghdad tried to cut off Kurdistan's, let's say, status as was recognized in the region. They did not recognize the Peshmerga as part of Iraq's defense forces, even though they are, and so on. And the political tension increased. In parallel with that, there was a great deal of sectarianism in Iraq, a kind of a fragmentation that had frankly always been there, but Saddam had kept a lid on it through sheer brutality. But now, instead of going for democracy and federalism in Baghdad, we were seeing a great deal of sectarianism where the Shia would marginalize the Sunnis and exclude the Kurds, for example. And this led to eventually the rise of Islamic State or ISIS. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that in 2014, that golden decade that I had spoken about came to a dramatic and shocking end as the Islamic State rose really a few years before 2014, but they kind of came to the world's attention in 2014. I think people don't see the slides again. So in 2014, why was ISIS accepted by some of the communities in Iraq? Because of the sectarianism, because of the failed and very negative policies that we were seeing by some of the political leaders in Baghdad, the sectarianism, the marginalization of this group or that group. And so when ISIS was campaigning, if you like, for support, the people who supported ISIS, some of them were just as brutal as ISIS. Others were misguided. They just thought that the government no longer represented them and had their interests at heart. And they thought, well, why not? Let's go with this group. But anyway, ISIS came on the scene, maybe a 40,000 strong terrorist group at its peak, including many, many foreign terrorists who traveled from the United States, from Europe, from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, Central Asia, I'll stick with that, and even Australia, to join ISIS and to rampage through Iraq and commit genocide against the Yazidis, against the Christians, and many, many other groups. And so what we saw was Kurdistan becoming the safe haven. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that by around 2014, 15, 16, Kurdistan region was sheltering 1.8 million displaced people from within Iraq and Syrian refugees who had fled the Syrian conflict and ISIS in Syria. And don't forget, Kurdistan region's population is only 5 million. So to take care of 1.8 million people in a who have arrived with nothing, and need your help, and it's a situation of life and death, it's a huge responsibility. And I'm very, very proud of how the people of Kurdistan embraced all of these displaced people who were fleeing genocide, fleeing for their lives with nothing. And they have really been absorbed into our society. We still have 39 camps in, I believe it's still 39, it's close to that number. We still have that number of camps in the Kurdistan region for many of the displaced, but 75% of the displaced people have now really been absorbed into the community and are living within our society and our cities and villages. Even today, we are still housing about 1 million displaced people from Iraq and from Syria. So fighting ISIS overnight, suddenly in 2014, we find ourselves protecting a 1,000 kilometer border with this new Islamic State. And we're having to protect our people, protect the displaced people, protect key infrastructure that was important not just for Kurdistan, but for all of Iraq. For example, the Mosul Dam, for example, some of the oil infrastructure in and around Kirkuk, because the Iraqi military just disappeared and didn't defend those places. They left their weapons for ISIS. So ISIS, this terrorist organization, ended up using very sophisticated weaponry that had been provided by America to the Iraqi forces, but they just left everything behind. And if we go to the next slide, we owe a debt of gratitude to the Peshmerga. And in Kurdish, Peshmerga means those who face death. And as I said earlier, Peshmerga are the legitimate military force of the Kurdistan region recognized by our law, and our laws and institutions are recognized within the Iraqi constitution. And just as in the United States, every state has a national guard, but that national guard, let's say Utah's National Guard, is part of the US defense system. It's part of the United States Defense Force. The same is true of our regional guard. The guard of the Kurdistan region, the Peshmerga, are part of Iraq's defense system. We fought ISIS at a time when there was nobody else to fight ISIS. The Iraqi army just disappeared, as I said, and left their weapons. And it was the Peshmerga who were fighting ISIS, and we lost more than 2,000 of our Peshmerga and over 10,000 who've been wounded. And this is just in Iraqi Kurdistan. Of course, in Syria, the number of people who were martyred and injured is even greater among the Kurds there. So we are very, very proud of our Peshmerga who fought against ISIS. They were outgunned massively. ISIS, as I said, had this sophisticated weaponry, but we're very, very grateful, and we always will be grateful to the United States for ordering airstrikes against ISIS and creating a coalition that still exists today to fight ISIS and to support local partners on the ground like the Peshmerga. And this is one of the reasons why I think our partnership with the United States continues to be very strong. Now, I spoke a bit earlier about the deteriorating relationship between our regional government and with the Iraqi government. And eventually we decided to have a referendum on independence. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that in 2017, a referendum was called inside Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and it was only for Iraqi Kurdistan. It did not involve Kurds in Syria, Turkey, or Iran. And the question in this referendum was a simple one. Essentially, would you like Kurdistan region to be an independent state? And the turnout was high. It was about 72%, and 93% said yes. Now, we expected to be able to negotiate with Baghdad after this referendum. We weren't, and we made it clear, we weren't going to declare independence unilaterally the next day. And we just saw this as a mandate for our political leadership to talk to Baghdad first and foremost, and to say, this is what our people want. You know, what shall we do? Perhaps we should have a looser federation, still keep Kurdistan within Iraq, but make it a looser kind of confederation. Perhaps we go for full independence. But the idea was that we would have a conversation about this. But that's not what happened. Baghdad responded, as unfortunately is the history of Iraq, by using tanks, by banning flights to and from Kurdistan, trying to put Kurdistan under an economic siege, a diplomatic siege, and military attack. And this, of course, is counter to everything that Iraq should be as a democracy. And it's also counter to what the Iraqi constitution stipulates, which is nobody should use military force to settle a political disagreement. That is actually stated in the Iraqi constitution. And sadly, this is what Baghdad did. So those were very, very difficult times for our people, great hardship, great fear, and if I'm honest, a sense of abandonment by the United States. But our relationship with the United States has been strong enough and has a long enough history, as I said, from really 1991, to be able to overcome even these strong disagreements as we had over the referendum. And I'm happy to say that today we have a strong relationship with the United States. Now, if we go to the next slide, and I will speed up a little bit because I think we're going to run out of time soon. Our partnership with the United States is very welcome for us. We want that partnership to grow and widen. If we go to the next slide, there's just a little bit of information about our mission in Washington, D.C. That's our building. Unfortunately, we're not there at the moment. We're having to work from home via Zoom, or we're still all working flat out, but we've had to close the office because of COVID-19 concerns. But we advocate for the people of Kurdistan, and we try to have as good and solid a relationship with the United States as possible. And we want to broaden that relationship. And this is why, for me, it's so important to have this kind of outreach to Americans outside Washington, D.C. We want to strengthen our ties with Utah. We already have very strong ties, I mentioned earlier with Congressman Chris Stewart, but also with LDS Charities, which has a very strong presence in the Kurdistan region and has supported many of those displaced and refugee communities and still does today. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Utah and to LDS Charities. And we want to broaden those ties. On one of my visits, I visited the World Trade Center. I spoke to the governor's office about, strengthening these ties. So the next slide is just a little bit of information about the US Consulate General in Erbil, our capital. We're hoping that next year, the new consulate building will be opened. It may be delayed a little bit because of COVID-19. The work has slowed, but when it opens, it will be the largest US consulate in the world and will be bigger than many embassies. So I think these are all symbols of our partnership. If we go to the next slide, you'll just see that, our relationship with the United States is really bipartisan. We've had a good relationship with President Obama, today with President Biden, who has visited Kurdistan numerous times and addressed the Kurdistan parliament in, I think, 2002 as a senator. And of course, this is our current president meeting with President Trump last year. The next slide shows a meeting we had with President Obama, and I was honored to be in that meeting. Just a very short slide about business ties with the United States. This is an area that we definitely want to broaden. Kurdistan has an oil and gas industry, and we have welcomed companies like Chevron and Hunt Oil, Hillwood Energy, but there are also many other companies, familiar faces like Ace Hardware. There's one near where I live here in DC, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and we would welcome businesses from Utah. One last thing, just to mention in the next slide, about the Kurdish community in North America. I'm so delighted to have met through you, through this discussion, Dr. Kamal Bewar, as a leading member of the Kurdish community, Kurdish-American community in Utah. But the largest Kurdish community, we believe, is in Nashville, Tennessee, numbering about 15,000. And it's often referred to as Little Kurdistan. So Emily, if you could just run through the next slides. These slides are really just to show you what Kurdistan looks like. We have beautiful mountains. It gets very hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. This is Erbil, our capital, which is the longest continuously inhabited city in the world. And I wanted to show you the old quarter and then the new Erbil, as you see, with the skyscrapers. And then just a few more slides to show you what Kurdistan looks like. And I very, very much hope that some of you will be able to visit Kurdistan and that we will be able to broaden our partnership with the United States and specifically with the great and wonderful people of Utah.